Hello and welcome to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. I'm Joe Ramage. I'm joined by Scott Wilson this morning. We're coming to you on Monday, the 22nd of January. Just before we get going, as usual, a shout out to our partner, the Fans Museum. You might have seen yesterday, I think it was, there was a piece went up about that partnership. Certainly want to keep an eye on and looking out over the next couple of weeks because there's plenty of fun and exciting things coming up with that. And as always, like, subscribe, share all of our content. You can subscribe for £1 for the next 6 months, well worth taking advantage of. But I suppose there's only one place to start, Scott, if we go back a couple of days. Now the dust settled. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, how are you doing? And have you warmed up from Friday?
I tell you what, yeah, it was a pretty miserable night for lots of reasons, wasn't it? It felt flat from the word go, and it needed the players on the pitch to give something of a spark. And I think that's pretty understandable given everything that's been going on around the club in the last 2-3 weeks, that it was going to be flat. And it just needed something to spark everything into life, and it just didn't happen, did it? It started flat and it got flatter. And then clearly by the end, it was pretty fractious as well as being flat. So, yeah, not a good night. Bitterly cold. Yeah, not an awful lot to celebrate, full stop, really. I hope if you were there as a fan, you had a couple of decent pints before or after, and at least that might have made it a bit more tolerable.
Yeah, I'm sure you needed it. I mean, there's a lot to go out in the days that have come since, but I suppose if we go back to on the field initially to start with, you said that it was flat there. Why do you think that was? I mean, tell us about the game that you saw. It was like I say, they just didn't. It was a weakened Hull side, and they just never really seemed to get good outside the sort of first 5 minutes for me. You know, because there was a little bit of a change of system. We saw, I think it was like 4-1, 4-1. Dan Neil pushed forward a little bit more, but outside of the sort of first 5 minutes or so, it just didn't really seem to get going. And Hull looked comfortable, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, I thought to a large extent the first half was a complete non-event from both sides. I mean, I think did both sides have one shot on target, and neither of them were really, what you would class as a decent opportunity. So, maybe a bit of feeling out, but I think the first half just never got going. And like I say, I think Hull were as poor as that as Sunderland were, and Leroy Rossini, to his credit, pretty much admitted as much afterwards that he felt as well that it was a game that was in danger of kind of drifting away to nothing. And it needed one of the teams to just step things up a little bit. And that's what Hull did in the second half, and Sunderland didn't. I mean, I still didn't think Hull were great in the second half by any stretch of the imagination. But, when they scored, I think it probably felt at that stage that if anyone was going to score, it was probably going to be them rather than Sunderland. And then they managed it out from that point onwards. Now, why is that happening? I mean, well, there's lots of different angles we can go at this, isn't there? I mean, Beale's management and tactics is clearly something that now fans are going to point the finger at, and we can't ignore. His record is starting to look not great at all. 3 defeats in a row, 4 defeats from his 7 games in charge. All right, the Newcastle game's a bit of an outlier in that. You can probably give him a pass in that. But his record in the Championship is not great. Again, he didn't really seem able to change in-game, which is a big worry with him, his substitutions. Already fans are kind of questioning those. They seem to come very late in the game. He seems reluctant to change tactics within games. I also think, in fairness to him, though, there are other elements other than his management that are at play here. I think a number of key players in this Sunderland team are bang out of form at the minute.
Yeah.
Pierre Ekwert and Joe Bellingham probably being the two prime examples that Ekwert has not looked himself really for best part of a month, maybe more now. I think Job's form has noticeably dipped in the last month or so as well. But I think what you've got to remember is they are two very, very young players who have, never played a full season of first team football week in, week out, like they're being asked to do at the minute. And we were chatting after the game. I think it was Matty I was chatting with, maybe yourself, that there are definite parallels here, I think, to that first Dan Neil season when Alex Neil, fairly controversially felt the need to take Dan Neil out of the firing line, even though Sunderland were pushing for promotion and needed results. And if you speak to Dan Neil now, he'll say, look, at the time I was furious about it. I was absolutely not happy about it. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's probably what I did need. I probably was running on empty. And it just feels like with Ekwa and Job, they just need a rest. Mentally and physically, they need to be taken out of that team just, for a spell. Now, clearly then the question is, well, are there alternatives there? Are the players there to do it? I think with Bellingham, there probably are. I think you could play a Bar. Pritchard's in at the minute, but he has been out. I think it's tougher with Ekwa because, as we've said, Sunderland do need another central midfielder. That's one of the areas that they're looking to strengthen this window. So, it probably is harder with Ekwa at the moment, with Corey Evans obviously being absolutely nowhere near a return. But sometimes I think you've just got to look at the bigger picture and find a way to do it. And we don't want to keep harking back to the previous regime and comparing Mowbray with Beale, because, eventually that's probably a bit unfair. But I still think that Tony Mowbray would be taking those players out if he felt they needed it, because it just felt like he got that bigger picture a bit better, and that he would potentially look to even if it means putting round pegs in square holes for a game, if that's needed, because, as I say, these young players are just not quite at the levels that you want them at, then I think that's something that Beale is going to have to look at in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think Job in particular is an interesting one, isn't it? Because he was asked about that, I think, before this game. Is there a worry about burnout? I think he's 18-year-old. He's played well over 50 games already in his career. And I think many would share that he's done well this season. He's probably been one of the summer signings that has stood out and, follows the model, and, he's ticking a lot of boxes. But like you say, you can clearly see that he is probably erring on the side of being burnt out and fatigued. How do you change it? I mean, you mentioned Bar there. I thought that was an interesting one because there was a lot of talk about him coming back into the side at Ipswich instead of Roussin. He then actually did quite well, probably his best game in a number of weeks, and then he was dropped, similar to like how Roussin was after scoring against Preston. Again, if you take that Newcastle game out of it, it just seems that there were two decisions that are a little bit strange to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Bar's an interesting one because I don't think he's a striker.
No.
I understand why they tried to kind of make him into one, because, as we have kind of said ad nauseum, Sunderland's 4 summer strikers just haven't worked and aren't in any kind of form and don't really look like doing the job that you need them to do. So I understand why Bar's been tried there. And he's, there have been games where he's done okay playing through the middle, but I don't see that as his best position. For me, he is either a number 10 or he's a wide attacker coming in and joining in like that. So I think he could slot in for Bellingham for a game. I think that is an option. I mean, Rigg, where, what we've seen absolutely nothing of Chris Rigg since he went off to play for England. Now, yes, we're talking about young players. He's the youngest of the lot, but he was in and around it at the start of the season, and Mowbray clearly had a fair bit of faith in him. Had he not gone off with England, I think he probably would have been. We would have seen an awful lot more of him than we have. So, that feels like it's an option for a game, at least to see exactly where he's at and put him in there. I mean, I'd be really surprised if he went in and completely let you down and looked incapable of doing it, because in all the games he's played thus far, he's looked perfectly at home at Championship level.
Yeah, I mean, I know he touched on the sort of travel with the youth team, didn't he, for a while, left out of the Ipswich squad. But yeah, he is one that has kind of drifted out of just, well, anyone's sort of mindset at the minute, which is odd considering how he started the season. Obviously, the goal against Southampton. Just to go back as well to Bar, I think another thing that was strange for me was obviously tactically, it made everything very narrow with Pritchard coming in off the right. And Hull started a left back in Matty Jacob, who I think Liam Rossini, he said it was only his third start in the Championship. Now, again, that just seemed odd to me that they never really sort of attacked that area of the field. It was all very congested, and that seems to be a little bit of a theme under Beale for me. It's very narrow, either in possession or out possession. Outside, you get out to Clark, but this side, moving over to the right, it's very, very narrow, especially with Roberts injured.
Yeah, and with Seals playing at right back, and Hume in the Friday night game having to switch across to the left. So you've got 2 fullbacks there. I mean, Sealt clearly is a young player with a lot of potential. They think a lot of him. You can see that. But for me, he is much more of a centre half than he is a right back. Now, that's not to say he can't do a job at right back, because, at the minute he's kind of having to. But he's not an attacking right back, is he? And Hume playing on the left, yes, he'll get forward. Yes, he'll give you a lot of energy. but he's not going to be that natural left footer who, if Clark cuts in, whips on the outside and gets by him and whips across into the box. So I think that exacerbates the problem, that if you've then got Pritchard and Clark looking to cut in from the flanks, which they both want to do to get involved in and around the 18-yard box, then really, in an ideal world, what you want is overlapping fullbacks who can then exploit that space, drag defend the fullback away, and potentially get across in themselves, or at the very least create more space for Pritchard and Clark to exploit. You haven't really got that when you've got Sealt and Hume playing there. So I think that is an issue. Now, again, in fairness to Beale, at the moment, in terms of the fullback slots, he really has no choice at all, does he? You know, so many Huggins out, obviously, a Lazy now out for about a month, he said after the game, which is clearly another bit of disappointment. So, you know, it's not like he can do an awful lot there. But it is then exacerbated if you're going to play Pritchard and Clark as your wide players and encourage them to cut in or accept that that's probably what they're going to do, because that's what the game generally revolves around.
Another key thing, obviously, going for it feels as though the attacking impetus certainly isn't the same as what we've seen certainly under Mowbray at the start of the season. I know he had his problems toward the end of his tenure. I'm just going to read you some stats here. Over the last 4 league games, XG on Friday was 0.77. XG at Ipswich was 0.48. Against Preston, it was 0.94. Against Rotherham, it was 0.53. In those games, the highest amount of shots was Friday night with 13, only 3 on target. The others have been 7, 7, and 10. Tells you that there's not as much going forward in the final third for a side that we're already struggling to score goals. You know, we've spoken ad nauseum about the striker situation, but if you're not creating the chances that even they were creating at the start of the season, whether that be in terms of XG or just your outright attempts at goal, it's not going to solve the problem, is it?
No, and I'm just delving here. Sorry, I'm just delving out the screen because I'm going to get my little pink stat book. Another one here. So, Ipswich. So obviously Hull didn't score in the league. Ipswich scored 1. Clark. Preston scored 2. Okay, Pritchard, Roosen. Rotherham scored 1. Clark. Hull scored 1. Clark. Coventry didn't score. Bristol City didn't score.
Yeah,
it's a very easy. You know, in some ways, it's a lazy line that if you stop Jack Clark, you stop Sunderland. But the last few weeks, it's really felt like that, hasn't it? It's felt like that if Clark is not scoring or creating something, then where are the goals going to come from Sunderland? Now, yes, Preston, they did it. They found a way. Pritchard with a great strike from outside the box. Roosen with probably the only goal Sunderland have scored all season, which was a proper striker's goal, if you like. So, yes, they've shown they can do it. But at the moment, that game feels like an outlier, really. And you know, everything else around it, where it's either Clark or nothing, feels a bit like where Sunderland are at the moment. Now, you know, there were periods under Mowbray where Clark was hugely important. Don't get me wrong. This is not a new thing. It's not suddenly come from anywhere. But it feels more pronounced at the moment because, you know, there have been periods this season when Job was in amongst the goals, when Dan Neil looked like he was capable of scoring in most games, when, you know, Pritchard, yes, a threat. When the strikers might not have been scoring, but looked a threat, whoever was playing through the middle. At the moment, that's just not really there. And if you're an opposition manager coming up against Sunderland at the minute, then I would think 80% of your pre-match preparation in terms of tactics and talk and game management is about how are we going to stop Jack Clark? Yeah. Because if you render him ineffective, as we really saw in the Newcastle game as well, when you know Trippier kind of had his number coming inside, well, where else was Sunderland going? And it's looked a bit like that in most of the games under Beale, which is a worry.
Yeah, I mean, if you include that Newcastle game, the XG 0.22, shots 6. Yeah. But these have all come under Michael Beale as well. You know, there's a trend, there's a downward trend that would suggest that they are kind of regressing in that attacking third as well. That's irrespective of the sort of Clark stuff that you just touched on.
Yeah, and it's hard to argue against that, you know, because it certainly felt like that on Friday night, didn't it? It felt like Sunderland could have played 3 games and probably still wouldn't have scored. And so, you know, we've understand.
I mean, what's the balance, isn't it? What's the balance? Because you could argue that they're a little bit more structured and organised out of possession. I mean, it's taken sort of a worldie goal from Sam Clucas down at Rotherham to score against them.
Yeah.
A set piece mistake against Ipswich, and then the first one against Ipswich which was unfortunate in terms of the deflection. And then on Friday night there was a deflection as well. So there's been a little bit of misfortune in goals have conceded. So you could argue they were a little bit more tighter, again taking that Newcastle game out of it. But that certainly seems to be at the sort of
the
risk.
Yeah. And the worry for me would be that I think football in general, but certainly football in the Championship, you don't tend to be successful by having a rock-solid defence and nicking games 1-0. If you're a side that doesn't score very many goals, you're going to struggle in the Championship because with the greatest will in the world, if you've got 4 defenders who are capable of going through 90 minutes and being completely rock-solid and not making any kind of errors and not coming under pressure, they're probably not going to be playing in the Championship. There's a reason why there are levels within football, and it's really, really hard, I think, to construct a Championship team that can win things by being superb defensively, but not having much at the other end. You have to score goals in the Championship, and that, as you've said there, that will be with the worry. If there is a desire to tighten things up at the back, okay. Sunderland, again, there were definitely periods under Tony Mowbray where Sunderland were leaking too many goals, and that proved costly. But if you're doing it at the expense of carrying a threat at the other end, then I don't think that's a tactic that's going to work in the long term in the Championship.
Again, it's another one that's interesting because under Mowbray, it just felt a little bit different in terms of it was quicker, it was a bit more exciting, wasn't it? I think that's a lot of things that I've been seeing, certainly in the days since Friday, kind of what's happened over the last 12 months. I think if you go back 12 months, I think it was the Middlesbrough game, the 2-0 at the Stadium of Light, and then they went to Fulham the week after in the FA Cup, and it kind of just felt like at that point, it was a club on the up, wasn't it? And there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of optimism. Certainly this season, or the last couple of months of this season, that has just drained away. Now, I know there's plenty gone on off the field that, again, we've spoken about certainly over the course of the last 6 or 7 weeks, and then the managerial change. But how can this turn around at the moment? Because, I mean, we saw...
Worry, isn't it? I mean, because it feels like at the minute it's the whole package that isn't right. If it was just one element, then you can say, okay, if everything's great off the pitch, but things aren't really clicking on it, well, okay, what do you look at? Do you change the manager? Do you change personnel? Do you bring new players in? Do you do this? Do you do that? If it's the other way and everything's great on the pitch, but things aren't quite right off it, well, a lot of that probably gets masked and a lot of that gets hidden because ultimately, if you're winning every week, that will cover you a multitude of sins. The big issue with Sunderland at the minute is that you cannot really put your finger at the moment on any element of the club where it's exactly where you'd want it. On the pitch, things have stagnated.
Yeah.
The role of the head coach, who is the head coach? Clearly, there's massive questions already about that. We all heard what was being sung towards the end of the game, even though he's only 7 games in. Speakman's role as sporting director, Kirill's, Louis Dreyfus's role as owner, investment into the club, and that's before we get into the kind of day-to-day gripes that fans have had for a long time about ticketing, about the Stadium of Light. It's everything, isn't it? Let's be brutally honest. There's an awful lot here that fans are pretty disgruntled about, and that makes it very hard to turn that round because you can tinker with one element of it, but the unhappiness at the other element still remains. And I don't want to be the kind of harbinger of doom and gloom, but it does feel at the moment with Sunderland that, it's going to take an awful lot of work in lots of different areas to get this back on track and get the fans right back on side and energized about it. Because the danger for me this season is not that the fans are angry, because if the fans are angry, that's a bit of passion, that's a bit of energy, that might spark something. Yeah. The danger with me is the fans become apathetic, and that the season that there's going to be no change in terms of Beale's position because the ownership have kind of put their flag in the ground and said he's our man, we're going to back him, and that they're going to do that for a reasonable period, aren't they? Because let's be honest, he is their man, and they have put a bit of stock in by appointing him. So if there is then a growing disconnect between the fan base and the kind of wider ownership and hierarchy at the club and everything, then my worry is that it just drifts into apathy and the kind of the kind of atmosphere and general mood that was undoubtedly there at the Stadium of Light on Friday night becomes the norm between now and the end of the season. And on the pitch, the season just drifts away to nothingness with Sunderland finishing in mid-table. Then I think it becomes a really hard sell then of, okay, well, how do you then create the energy and get it back for next season? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, listen, that feels like at the moment probably too pessimistic, because let's be, Sunderland are still in this promotion hunt. They're still in the playoff race very much. It's not going to take necessarily an awful lot to get them winning games again and get them going back up the league, and then things change. But I would worry if that didn't happen, that if the season did start just drifting away, win one, lose one, win one, lose one, win one, lose one, suddenly you're 10th. Okay. That would be my worry, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it there, the sort of balance between anger and apathy. It's certainly, it's no secret. It stemmed from the handling of the Newcastle game, hasn't it? That's the one that sort of lit the blue touch bit with everything, and it's brought everything sort of full circle. And obviously the managerial change within that. You mentioned there the chants after the game, getting sacked in the morning, Beale out. In the weekend since, Wise Men Say, we've had them on the pod already. They put a poll out. There was over 3,500 people, 91% saying that he should be sacked. And then also yesterday, fans have had Beale out trending on Twitter or X. It seems I've not sort of known this at the club. You've covered the club for a long time as well. It's just it feels as though it's going to be hard to turn this round from Beale.
It's happened very, very quickly, hasn't it? I mean, there's if you like me and you cover Sunderland, Borough and Newcastle, you've seen plenty of occasions in the past where managers have been unpopular. It's not unprecedented. But what probably is pretty unprecedented is that it's happened 7 games into his reign.
Yeah.
And, if this is not a Sunderland side that's battling against relegation,
no,
it's not disastrous. So that's why, for me, I struggle to see that the board at the moment would change anything, because it just it reflects so badly on them if they do it. What does it say about their judgment if they
is there a case, could you say that
taken to bring him in and then 7 games in decide they're going to get rid of him?
Could you say, we saw with Birmingham earlier in the season, obviously they got rid of John Eustace. They were 6th in the league. Fans didn't really agree with that. Brought Rooney in.
Yeah.
Didn't work. Got rid of him. Now, ironically, Tony Mowbray has gone in there.
Yeah.
Can it happen? I mean,
that's a good parallel. That's a good parallel, in fairness. But Birmingham dropped from about 6th to 18th, didn't they? I think that's what it would take probably at Sunderland for a change to happen. If Sunderland are hovering around in 9th, 10th, still kind of in the promotion argument, even if deep down it probably isn't going to happen, I don't think that they then change the manager, because everything that's being preached at the moment with Sunderland is it's long-term, it's strategic, we've got plans in place, we're not knee-jerk, blah, blah, blah. So it would go against an awful lot of what they've been saying for them to make that change. Now, like I say, with Rooney, it got so bad that it was pretty hard for them not to do it. And like I say, if in 2 months' time Sunderland have barely won a game under Beale and they're 16th, then that's a very different debate to what we're having at the minute. At the minute, it still feels way too early for them to do it. Now, the problem with that is that, as you've seen, the kind of mood within the fan base seems so overwhelming at the minute that every time Sunderland lose a game, particularly at the Stadium of Light, are you going to hear those chants and are you going to get that mood? It kind of feels like it at the minute. Now, maybe not every game, clearly Friday's performance wasn't very good either. If Sunderland play well but lose because of some controversial refereeing decision or whatever, that's different. But if you get performances and results like Friday's on a semi-regular basis, then I think every time that happens, questions will be asked about Michael Beale and his long-term future. And that's just the way that it's going to be when the mood seems so, so strongly set already at the moment.
I think the worry for me is you don't often see examples of a turn and deal once the majority of the fan base do go. It's very, very rare that you see a manager swing it back. I mean, one way that he could get to, obviously, results are what's going to dictate, as they always do, but particularly in this case, the 10 days left, or 9 days as we're talking left of the transfer window. There's been one or two players linked. Kiefer Moore, he came on for Bournemouth against Liverpool yesterday. Jan and Beale shut that down, didn't he, after the game? I think Macaulay Langstaff, another one. We understand that he's probably closer to a League One move at this moment in time. There was a quote as well that he said, "There's one or two areas we'd like to strengthen. It's a bit difficult, but because we're not the biggest, we haven't got the biggest pockets in that window in this division." Again, these aren't sort of comments and signs that Sunderland fans want to hear, or will encourage them that things are going to turn around over the next 10 days.
No, and it feels like at the minute that we're heading into the last 10 days of the transfer window with probably the biggest issues and question marks about, can they keep players? The Jack Clark thing is still hovering around in the background. There's definite Premier League interest in Patterson. I don't think it'll happen this window, but it's not absolutely out of the question that one of the clubs who have been seriously watching him and fancy him as a long-term number 2 come in. You've then got the Pritchard situation, which feels like it's got the potential to become a real mess if it isn't already one. So you're kind of putting out fires before you're then trying to bring in the 2 or 3 players that we know they're trying to bring in and that, let's be honest, they really need at the moment. So, what's a good window now for Sunderland at the minute? Clearly a good window is bringing in 3 players, 2 of whom are ready to go straight into the first team, blah, blah, blah. It's starting to feel now almost, though, that a good window for Sunderland might be almost hanging on to the players you want to hang into and just getting anybody in, which wasn't really where we were at the start of the month.
I mean, we spoke about it. I think I mentioned it to you after the game. You just wonder if the Stoke game on Saturday was to sort of follow a similar pattern. Is that what we saw on Friday? Does a Premier League club come and test the waters about Jack Clark in those final few days? And then if it is an offer that that meets the valuation, you put yourself in a really difficult spot then, because if you were to lose him days before the end of the window, you might have a lump sum of money, but my God, what a job you would have in trying to bring the fans
absolutely. I also think again, the Pritchard situation is a bit of a touchstone one now with the fans, because we all saw what happened at the start of the season. I think if Pritchard goes, then it sends out the message that this project, if you like, is absolutely hard and fast. There's going to be no flexibility in it. We will not offer contracts to players over the age of 30. We will cash in when players get to that level, come what may. Because as you say, in the last month, other than Clark, Pritchard's been the only creative outlet, the only spark in that Sunderland team at all. And if you're willing to say, well, we don't care about that, we need to get the money in, then that is a really, it's a really alarming message, I think, that sends out. So I think clearly Clark is absolutely fundamental. What happens to Jack Clark this month, if anything, will determine what happens to Sunderland in the second half of the season. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think in the wider narrative and the wider mood of everyone, I think the Pritchard thing is nearly as important.
Yeah, it's strange because it's all been played out on a backdrop of Sunderland still only being 3 points off the playoffs now. I know you can balance that up by sort of saying, I mean, again, the message at the start of the season was sort of a promotion push, automatic promotion, and that was kind of why we were led to believe some of the reason for Tony Mowbray's exit. It just feels as though, I mean, like I say, people looking from the outside, they might be thinking, well, why is there such hysteria going on? But we are at that kind of point, aren't we? It really is sort of a make or break end of this window and end of this month with the Stoke game as well.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I keep coming back to, because it kind of, again, ties in the on and off the field stuff. It's kind of impossible really at the minute with Sunderland to get a handle on one without paying some acknowledgement to the other. I mean, listen, what you've said there is absolutely right. Sunderland are still banging the promotion mix. I mean, there's obviously only a very, very limited. I don't actually know how many championship games are on at the weekend, but there's not going to be many because of the FA Cup. So, I mean, there'll be an awful lot of the teams up and in and around Sunderland aren't playing. So if Sunderland were to beat Stoke on Saturday, it's not inconceivable that they're either back in the playoffs or, right on the edge of it. And then you are kind of thinking, well, okay, bring a couple in that can strengthen it, and you're right back in this. But at the minute, it just doesn't feel like that, does it? That's not the general mood. And it could definitely do with a couple of signings just to reignite the place and create a bit of excitement and interest, if nothing else. They need a striker, don't they? We've been saying it all month. If this transfer window ends without Sunderland having brought in another centre forward who can go straight in there, then whatever else happens, you would have to say that it's been a failure of a window then, because that's been the fundamental issue on the pitch throughout this season, really throughout the whole of Mowbray's reign, and into Beale, you know what I mean? So if that doesn't get addressed, then that will be a bitter disappointment, I think.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's that ready to go issue. Like, Rooston's been in. One thing as well that I noticed on Friday, it's almost as though they need to learn to play with a striker again. There was a few times where Rooston was kind of pulling off the shoulder and into the channel and making those runs that you'd expect the striker to make. But Sunderland have played without a striker for so long now, they've climatised to it, that they might not necessarily be picking out that run every time that it's there. I mean, obviously, if you get a more experienced striker who's doing it more often and more, in better positions maybe, but it just feels as though they also need to probably
I think that's a valid point, and that comes back to the kind of Clark stats about the number of goals he scored this season as opposed to the number of assists he's created, which would not even have him in the top 30 or 40 championship kind of wide players, you know what I mean? Because so much of his game now has become about that cut inside and getting that shot away, and partly that's because that's his strength, but partly it's because he's had to do it. He's had to learn and hone that because there haven't been the strikers there to feed. So he's kind of had to do it himself. And that's the way that Pritchard's been playing as well, whether it's by design or whether it's by him taking upon himself to do that. So, I do think there is an element of that if Sunderland were to bring in, let's say they were to bring in a Kiefer Moore. If Kiefer Moore was to sign to Sunderland tomorrow, Sunderland would have to adapt the way that they're playing in the final third to get the best out of Kiefer Moore, because, you are right that at the moment, if they carry on playing the way they are, then Kiefer Moore probably looks as ineffective as Rooston, Mayenda, Hemir have looked, because he's not going to get chances created from him. He's going to have to pretty much create everything himself.
Good stuff. I think we'll leave it there because we've rambled on for over half an hour now. So, Scott, thank you very much for joining us this morning. You can stay on top of everything all Sunderland here at We Are Sunderland. If you subscribe for £1, that'll get you 6 months worth of coverage. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all of that funky stuff across social media, and we'll be back with another morning briefing later in the week.